So imagine a courtroom, the place where fairness is supposed to be the gold standard, where every decision is weighed carefully, and where the law itself stands as impartial. Now take a group of judges, seasoned professionals, who have dedicated their lives to upholding that law. They're given a series of hypothetical cases to review, the details in which are identical, down to the last comma, except for one thing: the race of the defendant. Some cases feature a Black defendant, others a white defendant. The researchers behind this experiment wanted to see if this one small change would make a difference in the judges' decisions. And what happened? Well, the results were eye-opening. Despite their best intentions and commitment to fairness, many of those judges handed down harsher sentences to the Black defendants compared to the white counterparts, even though the crimes were exactly the same. Now, these judges weren't acting out of conscious bias. They didn't sit down and decide to be tougher on one group over another. But hiding beneath the surface was something much harder to detect: implicit bias. This kind of bias works quietly, influencing our decisions without us even realizing it. It's like an invisible lens that subtly distorts our perception of the facts. Kind of like those funhouse mirrors where what you're seeing isn't the reality. Now think of Lady Justice, with her scales perfectly balanced, her sword at the ready, and that blindfold covering her eyes. That blindfold symbolizes the ideal: justice being impartial, unclouded by external factors. But what if, without realizing it, we slipped the tiniest crack into that blindfold? Suddenly that balance starts to shift. Decisions are no longer based solely on facts, but on unseen biases that skew our judgment. So this study that I just told you about, published in the Notre Dame Law Review, was a powerful reminder that even in places where impartiality is supposed to be absolute, bias can sneak in and twist outcomes. And if this can happen to judges, people who are trained to be objective and impartial, what does that mean for the rest of us? So today, think of yourselves not just as legal professionals, but as courtroom strategists. We're going to dissect these hidden biases, much like you would analyze the evidence in a case, to understand how they subtly influence our decisions. We'll explore practical strategies to keep these biases in check, because ensuring justice remains as blind as it's supposed to be isn't just a lofty ideal, it's a critical part of our job. Whether it's in the courtroom, the boardroom, or even in casual conversations, we all have a role to play in upholding the standards of fairness and impartiality. Hello, everyone. My name's Maya Toussaint. I lead social purpose at Clio. The social purpose portfolio helps advance Clio's justice mission to transform the legal experience for all through social impact initiatives like diversity, equity, and inclusion programming and various giving efforts. Think giving through our product to pro bono lawyers and legal clinics, encouraging paid time to employees for volunteering, and various mission-aligned donations and sponsorships. I like to tell people about something or about some of the social identities that I hold or that I'm bringing to the discussion, in addition to my professional role. I'm a bilingual Montrealer from the province of Quebec. Now, my bilingual is French and English. It was really hard for me to say Notre Dame and not say Notre Dame earlier. I am the only child of Trinidadian parents. My laugh is on several live tapings from Montreal's Just for Laughs Comedy Festival. I'm also a certified sommelier, which means I can drink wine and call it a professional hobby. I am a cat mom to Mr. LeVar Burton, who thinks he is a dog. And I've met Earth, Wind, and Fire twice, and I've seen them in concert 7 times. So, beyond my role and my love of funk and soul, I like to bring a broader lens to discussions, and that's informed by both professional experience and my personal passion for equity and inclusion. I'm here today not just as someone who works in social purpose, social impact, but as someone who deeply believes in the power of this work to create real change. So with that lens in mind, let's talk about what we're going to dive into today. We'll start by breaking down the concept of implicit bias, understanding how it operates, and why it's so critical to address. Then we'll explore practical strategies for recognizing and mitigating bias in our work, whether you're in the courtroom, in your office, or interacting with clients. And of course, we'll leave time for discussion because this is a conversation where everybody's input is valuable. So let's take a look at the agenda. Wait, I forgot to mention, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm definitely surrounded by them. I work at a legal tech company. My best friend is a lawyer. My partner's best friend is a lawyer, and his wife just became a judge. So while I may not have passed the bar, I've certainly picked up a few things along the way. Plus, I'm known across Canada as the go-to person for true crime podcast recommendations. So I've got that going for me as well. Now let's talk about how this session is structured. We're going to follow the flow of a legal process, or my version of it, keeping it all organized and on track. We'll kick things off with opening statements, where we'll establish the grounds for understanding implicit bias. Then we'll move into the discovery phase, where we'll identify how implicit bias manifests in our work and daily interactions. After that, we'll dive into courtroom strategy, discussing practical steps you can take to mitigate these biases in your work. Finally, we'll open the floor for deliberation, a Q&A session, where we can discuss these concepts further, and we'll wrap up with closing arguments to bring everything together. So let's start by laying the foundation for our discussion on implicit bias, what it is, how it operates, and why it matters. In legal terms, you may think of this as opening statement. We'll establish the grounds for understanding the concept. Implicit bias isn't about conscious prejudice or overt discrimination. It's about the automatic associations and stereotypes that can influence our decisions without us even realizing it. These biases are shaped by our experiences, our environments, and even the media we consume. And while they're often invisible to us, they can have a very real impact on the fairness and equity of the decisions we make every day. So in this first section, we're going to dig into what implicit bias looks like, how it sneaks into our thought processes, and why recognizing it is so crucial, especially in a field like law, where the stakes are high and impartiality is key. I like to start all discussions around our dimensions of diversity or social identities. They affect everything we do and how we interact with one another. They are at the root of how we experience the world. If you were in this morning's session on mastering difficult conversation, actually, was anybody in that session this morning? Lovely. So you're familiar with this wheel. We chatted about it earlier today in navigating, difficult conversations. Or perhaps you've seen the image of an iceberg, and above the surface are those visible components, those things that we see to be true of people or perceived to be true of people. And below the surface, below the water, are those invisible social identities. By a show of hands, how many are familiar with this type of wheel maybe, or the iceberg? Yeah, a few. Okay, cool. So when we think of diversity, more often than not, and again, it's kind of like that iceberg, we're thinking about visible diversity, what we see, that first impression, for example, ethnicity, perceived gender. This diversity wheel shows us just some of the dimensions that make us who we are. There are so many that aren't listed, but I wanted something a little colorful and clear for you. The big 8 socially constructed identities are race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, spirituality, ability, nationality, and socioeconomic status. What that means is these are the ones that we're most familiar with, that we come up against often and talk about often. Like I mentioned, social identity is at the root of how we as individuals experience the world. It's so helpful to think about them and, pause and ask ourselves, how are my social identities coloring how I'm seeing or responding to this situation? So now, implicit bias is like an invisible force subtly guiding our thoughts and decisions without us even realizing it. It's those automatic unconscious attitudes or stereotypes that seep into our minds from our experience, our culture, our background, all those social identities that we looked at just before. You can see how these different social identities, our environment, our upbringing, our country, any trauma that we've gone through, whether that's personal trauma, historical trauma, how all of this plays heavily into our implicit or unconscious bias. So these biases operate under the radar. They're quietly influencing how we interact with others, often leading us to act in a way or in ways that don't fully jive or don't fully align with our conscious beliefs about fairness. In the legal field, understanding and addressing implicit bias is crucial to ensuring that we contribute to a more equitable system and workplace. Implicit bias is like an autopilot mode for our brains, right? It kicks in when we're processing information quickly, too quickly to really think it through. Our brains are constantly bombarded with information, so they rely on shortcuts to make sense of the world. These shortcuts are shaped by our experiences, our culture. Remember those social identities I was mentioning? They're shaped by that, and even the media we consume. So how does this actually work? At any given moment, we're exposed to a huge amount of information, an estimated 11 million bits per second. Everything from the color of the walls to the sound of a horn outside. But our brains can only consciously process about 40 to 50 bits per second. So again, it's 11 million per second, and we can only consciously process 40 to 50 bits per second. That's like trying to read an entire book while only seeing a few words at a time. So to manage this, our brains filter information automatically. They're trying to do us a favor, sorting it into categories based on what we've seen before, what feels safe, familiar, or valuable. This is what psychologists refer to as fast thinking or system one thinking. It's quick, it's efficient, but it's also where implicit biases live. Our brain makes snap judgments about people or situations based on these unconscious filters, which can lead to biased decisions, reactions, without us even realizing it. For example, we might consciously associate certain traits with specific groups of people, like thinking someone is more competent or trustworthy just because they look or act in a way that aligns with our mental shortcuts. These biases operate beneath the surface. They're guiding our reactions, like I said, and decisions before we've had a chance to really think them through. Understanding how implicit bias works or how it operates is the first step to addressing it. By recognizing that these biases exist and influence our actions, we can start to slow down, question our automatic responses, and make more informed, equitable decisions. This quick, unconscious processing is generally helpful for survival. It keeps us safe by helping us recognize potential dangers in front of us, like, oh, there's a bear, I should run, that kind of thing. However, in professional settings, especially in fields like law, where decisions need to be fair and impartial, these unconscious shortcuts can lead to unintended negative results and consequences. For example, when making decisions about people, such as assessing a client's credibility or a colleague's competence, implicit biases can skew our judgment, potentially leading to unfair and inequitable outcomes. Our goal here is to recognize these implicit biases, interrupt them, and actively work towards making conscious and inclusive decision-making. By understanding how our brains operate, we can take deliberate steps to ensure that our actions and decisions contribute to a more equitable environment. Understanding implicit bias isn't just a theoretical exercise, it's a critical factor that directly impacts the fairness and equity of our legal system. The consequences of ignoring implicit biases are profound, with real-world implications that reinforce and perpetuate systemic inequality, both in legal outcomes and professional environments. One striking example comes from a recent study by the U.S. Sentencing Commission, which found that Black male offenders receive sentences that are on average 13.4% longer than their white counterparts for the same crimes. This disparity is largely driven by unconscious associations that influence how judges, jurors, and even attorneys perceive and evaluate defendants. Implicit bias also plays a role in professional evaluations. For example, studies have shown how even something as straightforward as reviewing a legal memo can be influenced by bias. We'll dive deeper into that study in a bit. But for now, consider how even these day-to-day judgments are impacted by implicit biases. But the impact of implicit bias doesn't stop there. It's present in the daily interactions and decisions within law firms and legal workplaces. Research indicates that women, particularly women of color, are often disproportionately tasked with administrative duties, which can detract from their ability to focus on billable work and career progression. Implicit biases also play a role in who gets invited to informal networking events, such as golf outings or after-work drinks, events that are crucial for career development, career advancement. The stakes are really high. In the courtroom, implicit bias can affect everything from jury selection to sentencing decisions, potentially leading to unjust outcomes for those who are already marginalized. In the workplace, these biases can create environments where certain groups are systematically disadvantaged, leading to inequities in career development, job satisfaction, and overall representation in leadership roles. Addressing implicit bias isn't just about correcting individual decisions, it's about upholding the integrity of the entire legal system and the legal profession. Public trust in the legal system hinges on the belief that justice is administered fairly and without prejudice. Judge Victoria Pratt talked a lot about these ideas yesterday in the evening keynote. When implicit biases lead to unequal outcomes, this trust is eroded and the legitimacy of the legal system is called into question. The good news, we have the power to change this by recognizing and addressing our own implicit biases. We can start to build a legal system and a workplace that actually live up to the ideals of fairness and equity. It's not about being perfect, it's about being intentional. It means taking a hard look at our own biases, challenging them, and making conscious decisions that reflect our values. By doing this, we're not just talking about justice and inclusion, we're actually making them happen. So as we dive into these tools and strategies, let's keep in mind that this work isn't just about checking a box or meeting a quota. So now that we have laid the groundwork for, or by understanding what implicit bias is and why it matters, let's move into our discovery phase, where we begin to identify where these biases live, where they show up in work and daily interactions. This phase is all about uncovering those hidden influences that can affect our decisions without us even realizing it. So we've talked about how our brains rely on shortcuts to process the vast amount of information we encounter every day. But how do these shortcuts or implicit biases manifest in real-world situations, especially in legal settings? Let's dig into that. We've already touched on how implicit bias can affect professional evaluations, but let's dive deeper into a specific study that really highlights this point, the Written in Black and White study. Show of hands, how many of you have heard of this study? Oh, this is exciting. Okay. So here's what researchers did. They created a legal memo with a few intentional errors, because let's face it, nobody's perfect. Then they sent this memo to a group of law firm partners asking them to evaluate its quality. Half of the partners were told the memo was written by a Black associate, while the other half were told it was written by a white associate. The results were pretty eye-opening. Even though the memos were identical, the feedback was dramatically different. The memo attributed to the Black associate received more negative comments and was rated lower overall compared to the one attributed to the white associate. We're talking about the exact same content, but the perception of the author's race significantly impacted the evaluation. Now, this isn't just an academic exercise. It's very real, or has very real implications in a law firm. Evaluations like these affect who gets the big cases, who moves up the ladder, and who eventually makes partner. When evaluations are skewed by implicit bias, it's not just one decision that's affected, it's someone's entire career. But the takeaway here isn't just about identifying the problem, it's about figuring out what we can do next. And just an aside, in the app, I put together all my resources so you can check some of these studies that I'm referencing in the app at the bottom under handouts. Once we become aware of these biases, we can start to counteract them, ensuring our decisions are based on actual merit, not unconscious assumptions. And that's what we're focusing on today, how to identify and address these biases in our work. Implicit bias isn't just a theoretical concept, it shows up in concrete, measurable ways in our work, whether it's during critical moments in the courtroom, client interactions, or even in team dynamics. These biases can subtly but significantly influence outcomes, undermining fairness and equity. Take jury selection, for example. The decisions we make about who serves on a jury are often unconsciously influenced by biases, shaping the fairness of the trial right from the start. Without realizing it, we might favor certain candidates over others based on factors that aren't related to their qualifications as jurors. Then there's the issue of sentencing decisions. Racial biases can come into play here, leading to harsher sentences for certain groups like we saw, even when the crime and context are identical. We've seen this in studies showing sentencing disparities that raise serious questions about justice and equity. And finally, it's not just, courtroom settings. Professional evaluations can be impacted too. We talked about the written in black and white study. It demonstrated how the same legal memo was judged more harshly when the evaluator believed it was written by a Black associate. These kinds of unconscious bias can affect our career progression and opportunities, like I said. So raise your hand if you've seen or suspected bias influencing these kinds of decisions in your own experience. I mean, I imagine it's everyone, if not close to. But implicit bias doesn't just show up in high-stakes decisions. It's present in our daily routine interactions, too. These everyday moments are where biases often go unnoticed, but can still have a lasting impact. For example, and we talked about it, task distribution in the workplace. Who tends to get asked to organize meetings or handle social events? Research constantly shows, like I mentioned, that women, especially women of color, are more frequently assigned these non-billable tasks compared to their male counterparts. Over time, this can really affect their career advancement since they're spending more time on tasks that don't actually contribute to promotions or bonuses. Networking and informal interactions like that, the golf tournament, etc., things like this. This is another area where these biases creep in. Who gets invited to after-work drinks? Who gets invited to these social networking opportunities? These events might seem casual, but they're often key opportunities for networking and career growth. Hopefully you're doing a lot of good networking here at CleoCon as well. So whether because of unconscious bias or scheduling around things like family obligations, these biases, it creates barriers to inclusion and equity. Now, identifying where bias shows up is important, but even more crucial would be figuring out what we do about it, right? Recognizing bias is just the first step. We'll dive into how we can actively mitigate these biases in our decisions. We'll call this our courtroom strategy. So think of this section like as a tactical approach to reducing the influence of bias in our decision-making processes. Implicit biases are deeply ingrained, but they're not immovable. Well, except for like a few people that we all know. With the right strategies, we can create processes and environments that minimize the impact of these biases and promote fairness and equity. We'll take a look at some practical steps that you can take to ensure that your decisions, whether again in the courtroom, boardroom, everyday interactions, are as unbiased as possible. I know we have a mix of professionals in the room today, lawyers, paralegals, people in private practice, those working in larger firms, smaller firms, so many important roles where this has an impact. You might be wondering how these strategies fit into your specific role, especially if you're not in a leadership position or the one making the big decisions. I'd argue that the truth is bias mitigation is everyone's responsibility, and each of us, no matter our title, has influence over the culture of our workplace. So even if you're not making final decisions, you can still impact the way biases are addressed in your day-to-day interactions and help create a more inclusive environment. So what can we do to mitigate these biases? Let's focus on 3 key strategies, each packed with practical steps that you can start implementing right away. So let's start with our first one, slowing down decision-making. Sounds pretty straightforward. We've talked a lot about how implicit biases are a product of our brain's need to make quick judgments. This is what psychologists call fast thinking, like I said, system 1 thinking. It's automatic, intuitive, and incredibly efficient, and great for making snap decisions in situations where we need to act quickly, like when we sense danger. But in the context of legal work, where decisions need to be fair, impartial, and well considered, fast thinking can lead us astray. When we slow down our decision-making process, we give ourselves the time to move from fast thinking to slow thinking, or system 2 thinking. This is more deliberate, analytical mode of thinking where we carefully consider the facts, weigh the evidence, and are more likely to notice and counteract our implicit biases. For example, let's say you're about to evaluate a colleague's work or decide on a sentencing recommendation. Instead of going with your initial gut reaction, take a moment and pause. Ask yourself, am I being influenced by any stereotypes or assumptions? Or am I considering all the relevant facts equally, regardless of who is involved? This pause allows us to engage our more reflective, conscious mind, helping to ensure that our decisions are based on merit and evidence rather than unconscious biases. In practice, this might look like taking a brief break before making a big decision, revisiting your evaluation criteria, or discussing your thoughts with a colleague to get a second perspective. By intentionally slowing down, we create space for more thoughtful, fair, and equitable decision-making. Something that's particularly critical in your profession, where the consequences, as we've said, can have a profound impact. Let's talk about standardizing processes. One of the most effective ways to reduce bias in decision-making is to create clear, objective criteria for how decisions are made. When we rely on subjective judgments, it's easy for unconscious biases to creep in and influence our choices, whereas standardizing processes helps to minimize this risk by ensuring that everyone is evaluated against the same criteria. For those of you who might not be making hiring or promotion decisions directly, you can still influence standardized processes in other areas. Maybe it's about advocating for more transparent criteria when reviewing work, or making sure everyone in the team feels like their contributions are being recognized in the same way. Small changes in how work is evaluated or how meetings are structured can make a big difference in reducing bias. Take hiring, for example. If your law firm or your organization uses a standardized interview process With a consistent set of questions and evaluation criteria, it reduces the likelihood that personal biases will influence who gets hired. The same applies to performance evaluations, promotions. By applying the same standards to everyone, you create a level playing field where decisions are based on merit, not on unconscious preferences. Standardization doesn't mean stripping away the nuance of individual cases or people, but it does mean that you're making decisions from a more consistent and fair, transparent foundation. It's about creating a process that everyone can trust, knowing that they're being judged by the same yardstick as everyone else. So as you think about your own work, consider where you might implement or improve standardized processes. Are there areas where subjective judgment could be reduced by applying a more consistent criteria? Are there processes that could be made more transparent to ensure fairness? By standardizing how we make decisions, we take a significant step towards mitigating implicit bias in our work. Finally, let's talk about fostering open dialogue and committing to continuous learning. Addressing implicit bias isn't a one-time ask. It's an ongoing process that requires regular reflection, discussion, and education. It's already great that you're here today at this session and at the other personal growth sessions. Creating a culture where biases can be discussed openly is key. It's about building an environment where people feel safe to raise concerns without fear or judgment of retaliation. That is psychological safety. By a show of hands, how many of you feel like you're not directly maybe involved in decision making, but you still want to play a role in reducing bias? Okay, half. And then the other half, it's because you play that role. So this is great. So here's the reality. Whether you're managing a team or collaborating within one, every action contributes, right? It could be raising awareness during discussions or simply reminding the group to slow down before making decisions. Often it's about planting the right seed of thought at the right moment. In more challenging environments, focus on what's within your control. It might be suggesting small tweaks to workflows or supporting colleagues who might be facing bias. Tools like feedback mechanisms or diversity committees can also help formalize these conversations. I often hear, what if leadership isn't open to discussing these biases? That's a valid challenge, but influence can come from how we model behavior ourselves. For example, if you notice a pattern in how tasks are assigned or how clients are treated, raise the issue. The goal isn't to blame, but to improve the fairness and inclusivity of your practices. True psychological safety means knowing you can raise concerns without negative consequences. Continuous learning is crucial too. Biases evolve as new information and experiences shape us. That's why regular bias training, workshops, and educational resources should be a part of your professional development. It's about staying proactive in addressing biases as they arise. When we commit to open dialogue and ongoing learning, we create a work environment that's not only more equitable, but also more adaptable. Bias mitigation becomes part of the culture where everyone plays a role in contributing to a fairer and more inclusive legal system. So as we move into the Q&A portion of our session, I want to acknowledge that while I've shared strategies and insights on mitigating implicit bias, I'm not a legal expert, and some of you in this room have years of experience dealing with the nuances of the legal system. So this is an opportunity for us to have an open discussion. If there are questions that dive into specific legal nuances, I may not have the answers, but I'm sure there are others in the room that could help out and share their expertise. So hopefully this is a conversation. So let's treat it like a collaborative space, whether it's about the strategies that you've seen, that you're using, that we've discussed. Would love to hear from you. So there will be a mic available, so you just need to raise your hand and we'll get to you. And let's go from there.
My name's Lai. I'm from Toronto. I'm a lawyer and a part-time judge, so I saw the beginning part was interesting. How do you deal with negative reactions to inclusivity, diversity, equity? There are many people who question it. How do you deal with that?
How do you deal with the negativity or the some of the folks that think that DEI isn't maybe worth it and things like that? So I do a lot of consulting and external training on a lot of these related topics. Anything that you can think of under the sun that's related to diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, microaggressions, unconscious bias, all that stuff, which arguably I think is just about being a better human. I try to make it relatable because when we talk about the social identities, no matter what, we all have social identities, and it's about kind of figuring out what's maybe important to that person and what would make them maybe feel included. And I try to frame it in a bit of a softer way. There are some folks, and we mentioned it this morning in the difficult conversation session, some conversations are toxic, which is different from difficult. Toxic, maybe you need to walk away from it. Some folks may be toxic as well and will never get there. If there's room, if there's space, I've found that through just listening and kind of, why do you feel that way? Because I think there's a misunderstanding about what it is we're talking about. Because if we were all doing this, everybody would benefit. So it's a question of, well, I'd like to think like you would hate to be hurting your colleague. You would hate to be hurting your friends. But if you have these biases, these things that make you act in a certain way, you are hurting folks. And that reminder that it is unconscious. We all have it. It doesn't make you a bad person. I'm open to being corrected regularly. And I would hate to find out in a year that I offended someone at the conference this year. I would rather know now so I can learn and fix it. So I try to lean in on and also feel free to throw me under the bus if you're talking to someone. I was at this conference. This woman named Maya said da-da-da, and you can say whatever you need to related to this. To get through it in terms of, that's actually a bit of a biased comment or what have you. Did you know that our brains are taking in 11 million bits of information? Like, we don't have time sometimes to be as good as we would like, And so just kind of reminding it. That was a long answer for you. Maybe you picked something out of that. Does anyone? Yes, please.
I have another question. I am a child protection and family law attorney, and in the child protection side, each case is assigned a social worker. So I'm often in a space where I'm the only African-American attorney in the room, and each time I enter said room, I'm always assumed to be the social worker instead of the attorney. For example, before going into court, there's a room that has a very clear sign that only attorneys are allowed to sit in there. And when I'm in there, everybody looks at me like, oh, you're the social worker? I'm like, no, I'm the attorney. So how do you navigate being in those spaces, and how do you create a conversation to point out someone's implicit bias towards you?
That's a really good question. And I don't know if any of you were in Corinne Lightning's session yesterday around cultivating inclusion and belonging. She's an Indigenous lawyer in Canada, and she was talking about, even going to court and folks thinking she was the defendant, making clear assumptions based on how she looked. Depending on your level of spicy, hear me out. I sometimes just ask the question back to folks like, how come you thought I was the social worker? And that pause, creating that pregnant pause, as they say. And it could just be that, like, wow, people just didn't realize, and they're maybe trying to be friendly to help you know that it's in the other room, but why did you assume I was the social worker and not the lawyer? So I tend to ask the question back sometimes, again, of course, if appropriate, if safe, etc. And also thank you for your work. I think we talk a lot about how representation matters, and people aren't seeing a lot of Black lawyers. So for them, that it's not their instinct to think you are a lawyer. So one way is through kind of asking the question back, because I don't want to tell you to, Corinne was joking yesterday. She's like, I even bought one of those bags so they would think I was a lawyer, but that didn't work either. And it's like, you shouldn't have to. But I know for myself that I will dress a certain way when I go to a nice store so that they aren't following me and things like that. So again, everybody has that bias, but if we can maybe work from the place of, okay, this person was probably about to help me find the right room, but let me ask them why they think, no, I'm a lawyer. Why did you think I was a social worker? Do I look like someone and just being playful, that can help sometimes. Does anyone else have any tips for that question? or a question?
I actually get that all the time, and I dress very nice for work. I think I look like an attorney, and sometimes I'll be jokeful and playful back and say something like, oh, it's because I look so young, isn't it? I get that all the time.
That's good.
To kind of make them realize that they did have a bias against me, but also not make them feel bad about it, because it like you said, it is unconscious, and kind of leads me to my question. Like, I've kind of figured it out for myself and how to make myself feel comfortable, but a lot of times I'll have I do family law. And so a lot of times I'll have interracial clients or, LGBTQ clients, and the other attorney on the other side might not be so aware of their own bias. So I do a lot with bias with the other attorney. Maybe my client's African American and wanted cut their child's hair this way, and his client's Anglo and they didn't want. So then we're dealing with biases between the parents because they're interracial, and then opposing counsel, and then a lot of times the judge. So I haven't figured out what to do with opposing counsel when their client's being biased, or opposing counsel's being biased, or the judge, because there's so many different ways. And so that's where I'm struggling with trying to figure that part out.
That's a lot of layers and a lot of navigating on behalf of others as well. And so, again, not being a lawyer, but I imagine in the moment for you, what becomes most important is, okay, who do I serve in this moment in terms of how does it serve my client best, or who best? Is it the time to correct the other attorney? Is it the time to correct the judge? Ooh, will they think that? And does this affect the judgment, etc.? I try to, again, reference the thing as much as possible and just saying it out loud. When people hear it a second time, sometimes you can realize how ridiculous it sounds. I've said a lot of stupid things, and then right after, I'm like, what? Let me say that again. Oh, okay. Nope, that's not it, Maya. That's not it. And so if another attorney is saying something like, oh, your kid's hair, da-da-da, and it's like, what are you trying to do with that statement right now? What are you hoping to get out of that comment? But it's hard to, I imagine, get and give advice in your particular situation, because there's so many different layers, and I'm sure a lot of you deal with that. And it's kind of like also holding your own peace and making sure your mental health is okay and that you're able to get through the day is important too. So it's, knowing which battles that you need to get involved in. Would be curious to hear if anyone else can relate to that, or how do you navigate when it's got the biases here, the biases here, the biases here. What do I deal with? But it is a balance, I imagine. But I find as much as possible, especially now, and I say especially now, especially in the last 4 years, the verbiage, the language that I'm using, it is familiar. We're talking about it. And so there is more of an openness to, hey, by the way, I went to this thing and I figured out that, these are microaggressions. I know you mean well. I know you're a really fair person, but I was just wondering why you said that. And then it's like, gosh, oh, okay. And it kind of can make the person pause. Yeah. Got a question over here, please.
Hi, my name is Janice Dantas, and I'm a Filipino attorney, and that's happened. And I think, for me, I just view it as trying to keep the lines of communication open and not demonizing the other side for not knowing something, or because once you demonize them or you make them not human, you don't want to engage and talk about it. So I've tried to keep an open mind about that, and I encounter many of those things as well in family law in particular. And for me, I do want to just have a positive note because I have young kids and other colleagues have young children. Yeah. And it is changing. One of the judges, her son commented, so what kind of law does she practice? So now it's becoming a thing where, lawyers can be men or women, but it's defaulting to women because he saw his mom as a lawyer. His dad was not a lawyer, so he viewed a lawyer's more likely to be a woman than a man. So that gives me some hope that, in a generation, the perceptions are different.
I agree. Thanks for that. Any other questions or comments?
Well, on that note about kids, I'm trying to raise my white boys to be good humans. And I wondered if you, in your work, have come across anything that would help us raise our kids to let go of some of these biases.
Yeah. Now, what's nice is the kids, they start off pretty clean slate. You know what I mean? And I showed you the social identities. Our parents are an aspect of our social identities and how we're raised. So thank you for being aware and wanting to instill goodness in them. And I think remembering that, and yeah, I'm generalizing on purpose right now. In general, non-white parents do have to have a race talk with their kids to help them navigate some of the pains in the world, and of course the wonderful joys. But having those conversations when you maybe don't think you need to is really important, and just talking about all the things, like when you see something on the news, if it's maybe a teaching moment or just like hey, did you know that this kind of thing happens, but not in our house, I think that's one way. There, depending on the age of your children, any of you, there are a lot of wonderful kids books out there around. And again, the framing is just about being a good human, because it's just about education and treating folks the way that we want to be treated. There's some wonderful kids books, but I think what's nice is, and like you mentioned, I feel really good about the kids. Like I see the interactions, and because their social identities there's more potential layers because of social media and things like that. There's a lot of good in social media, and that they're hearing from other folks who are thoughtful and open and inclusive. So just the fact of what you said, that you're wanting to do this, like, that's already huge. So thank you for that. Yeah. Great.
Hi. You know what? One thing I've learned, obviously, growing up in a society that was very prejudiced and racist and chased me out of there before they finally changed the government in South Africa, is that the one thing I've taught my children is we talk about issues, but we also call people out when they make statements that are inherently prejudiced, whether it's related to race, religion, whatever it is. So I have taught them that when they experience it, not to sit back, because I've always said to them, quiescence is acquiescence. By your silence, you're consenting to it. So when somebody behaves that way, you don't have to confront it in an aggressive way, but you still got to bring it to their attention. So I think proactively addressing that so that they don't just allow it to happen, don't participate, but let it go on, it's important for them to step forward and say, that's not right, that's not the way people should be treated.
Thanks for saying that. Absolutely. When, again, assuming it's a safe situation, calling it out is so important. Your safety is first. But I also believe that as well. So thanks for that great info and some tricks and everything. Let's do a recap of the key points we've covered before we go. First, we talked about social identities, how each of us carries a unique set of visible and invisible dimensions of diversity that shape our experiences and our interactions. Recognizing these identities is essential in understanding how implicit biases form. Next, we defined implicit bias and discussed how it manifests in both the courtroom and in the workplace, influencing decisions in ways we might not even realize. We explored the real-world impacts through studies like the written in black and white case. We then moved on to where bias shows up in daily interactions, from assigning tasks and deciding who gets invited to important meetings and networking events. Even small everyday decisions can contribute to larger patterns of inequity. And finally, we looked at 3 practical strategies for mitigating bias. So slowing down decision-making, standardizing processes, and fostering a culture of open dialogue and continuous learning. So these strategies are key to ensuring that our decisions are fair, that bias awareness becomes part of our everyday practice. As we talked about today, implicit bias can influence our decisions both in and out of the courtroom, but by increasing awareness through training, standardizing processes to reduce subjectivity, and fostering an environment where open dialogue is encouraged, we can make these practices a regular part of how we operate. So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this. Mitigating bias is an ongoing process. All this being human work is an ongoing process, right? It's not something we do once and check off a list. It's something we need to revisit regularly as we grow in our personal and professional lives. The strategies that we've discussed today, hopefully you can start using right away, but the real key is consistency. The more we make bias awareness a regular part of how we work and interact, the more we contribute to an equitable legal system and workplace, because remember, we all have bias. Unconscious bias is called that for a reason. It's a part of our social identities, and we just need to pause and ask ourselves, why am I making this decision? Why am I reacting this way? You'll be surprised how that extra second, giving yourself a second opinion, can change an outcome. By a show of hands, and this is a vulnerable moment for me, how many of you feel like you've gained some new strategies or something to maybe munch on in your brain that you can take back and apply? Okay, thank you. Thanks for that. Need a little boost. It helps me know that this was helpful and time well spent together. I want to thank you all for your attention, your questions, your interaction, and sharing your engagement. I appreciate you. I know you're going to go on and really commit to making bias awareness and mitigation central to your work. If you'd like to continue the conversation about this or wine or funk, or have any questions at all, I'd be happy to chat afterwards. I'll stick around. I know we have another session, but we have a little bit of buffer. And also, I'm told I'm easy to spot in a crowd. You can find me a little bit later. Enjoy the rest of your time. Thank you so much. Thank you.